get together and we look for answers to questions about about anything, right? We're interested in truth, spiritual, philosophical, logical. I would just truth, because we believe that all truth comes from where?
God.
Yeah, God is true. God is love. Right? Those God is statements. If God is truth, then any place you find truth, that truth comes from God, right? Or it is of God, is maybe the way to think of it. And so no matter what the truth is, we aren't afraid of it because we want to believe what is true. We're not interested in defending tradition. We're not interested in defending opinion. We just want to find out what is true. That's what we want. And sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes the truth is nice. Sometimes it's indifferent. but whether it hurts or is nice, we're interested in what is true. So tonight,
Definitely.
What was that?
I said definitely. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm glad you agree. That's good. So tonight we're going to look at a question that got sent in, and it is, does God hear the prayer of sinners? That was the question. And when you found out that was the topic, what were your initial thoughts?
I wish I had found that out more than 2 minutes ago.
What?
I wish I...
What? Yeah, so does God, what are your initial thoughts? Like, how would you answer that? If somebody came up to you and said, hey, does God hear sinners when they pray to him? What would your initial answer be? Just kind of your gut reaction. How would you answer?
Can we talk to somebody else about this?
That's a good, like, if you don't know, or just pretend it's any question. If you don't know the answer, say, I don't know. Let's go look for the answer. That's always the right thing to say if you don't know. Right?
Well, that would be mine then.
That would be your gut reaction. You don't have a yes or a no leaning one way or the other?
I'd probably say yes.
I would probably lean towards yes, but I wouldn't want, I don't know. I'm not sure that I would have a definite answer because I've never considered that.
Okay. Zane, why would you say yes?
Because of just one instance, the guy in the temple,
The guy in the temple.
the tax collector.
Oh, the
Like,
publican,
yes.
the Pharisee and the tax collector. Mm-hmm.
Oh, the parable that Jesus tells?
Mm-hmm. So tell us about that parable.
Well, there's a Pharisee and a tax collector looked down upon by most people. And they both go up to the temple to pray, and one of them goes up and it's like, oh, man, God, you're really lucky to have somebody like me because I'm pretty good. But then another guy comes up. He says, he doesn't even look at sky. And he says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus asked the question, which two of those men do you think went home purified? Mm-hmm. And the answer is the sinner, the tax collector guy.
Yeah, so that parable is in Luke 18. And so if you've got your Bible, you can just turn over to Luke 18. Jesus is telling a couple parables in that section. But we're gonna look in Luke 18, and let me see. Pharisee and tax collector, starting in verse 9. Right? So here's the Pharisee and the tax collector, and we are gonna read it. So why don't one of you read it? You did a good job summarizing it, Zane. You want to read it?
Okay. Keep forgetting about these microphones. He also told this parable to someone who trusted in him, in themselves, that they were righteous and treated others with contempt.
Pause there. So he told this parable to who?
Someone who is self-righteous.
Someone.
Yeah, to some who, right? So just to people who, and there is a pervading idea throughout human history, a prevailing idea that is pervasive, that you can do stuff to make you right with God. And now what I don't mean is that there are things that God asks people to do. For example, God speaks to Moses and tells him to strike the rock and water will come out of it. Does God expect Moses to hit the rock?
Definitely.
Yes, right? He expects that Moses will do that. Later, he tells Moses to speak to the rock, but Moses hits it not once but twice. It's so, I mean, the first time might have been a mistake, but the second time, you know that he hit it on purpose. What? Did God expect Moses to actually go talk to the rock?
Yes.
Yes. So we're not saying, just to be clear, we're not saying that God has no expectations, right? God expects people to listen to him. And so when we're talking about justification by works, we don't mean that God has no expectation of obedience, right? God is the king, the creator of the universe, as far as the Bible presents him. That's the view that we're taking. He is the sovereign Lord of the universe. He is in charge of everything. And since he's in charge, he has the right to expect that you would obey him, right? Just from a purely authoritative standpoint, he has the right to expect obedience. For example, in Nashville, it is illegal, right? The government has decided, the state government, so in Tennessee, the state government has decided that it is illegal for you to shoplift. Do you have to obey that law?
Yes.
No.
No, you don't have to obey it. You should. If you don't obey it,
Technicalities.
no, if you don't obey it, does the government go, oh, well, it was really just more of a suggestion?
No.
No, you get arrested, right? Because not only is there the expectation that you will follow what they say, but there is also a consequence if you don't. That's what it means to be sovereign. It doesn't mean that all the citizens, the state of Tennessee is a sovereign state. It's in charge of itself. And so when they make a law, it doesn't mean that now they go around and they force everybody to obey the laws. It means they expect you to respect their authority and to obey. Right? That's the expectation. So God expects that when he asks people to do something, that they would actually do it. So when we talk about justification by works, we don't mean that there's no expectation. You can just do whatever you want and it's not a big deal. That's not what we mean. What we mean when we say justification by works is what?
People who think that they can earn their way into heaven by either being perfect or doing enough good deeds or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. Zane, anything to add to that? No? Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of what justification by works is. And now there's even another thing. So Paul in Romans will talk about two separate things, justification by works and justification through works of the law, right? Those are two separate, although somewhat inclusive things, but there are some differences between those two statements, right? So Abraham obeys God, believes God. In Genesis chapter 15, God says, hey, Abraham, I am going to give you a son. And in verse 6, it says, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. That's before the law. Right? So that is not a work of the law. What would a work of the law be?
Like under the Old Testament law?
Yeah, the law of Moses.
Like wearing the 4 tassels on their robes?
One of my favorites. It is. It's one of my favorite laws. Zane, you got an example?
Not rounding the corners of your beard.
What does that even mean?
No idea. So traditionally, my understanding, it means that it's straight down, right? Like you don't round it is kind of the idea. So your beard has corners is all that it means, I think. Anyway, so there is an expectation that you will do what the law says. God gave them a law, so God expects that they will follow it. They won't trim their beard the wrong way. They won't wear their clothes the wrong way. There's an expectation. But the justification through the works of the law means that if you think that having the law, being a Jew, having the law, and keeping the law is the reason that you are saved, right? God has given us this law, and in keeping it is our identity. Right? We are the people who wear the tassels. We are the people who don't cut our beards the wrong way. We are the people who do those things. That is why we are saved. Right? That is our identity before God, is the law keepers. That's kind of the idea. Where the Pharisee in this parable we're going to see is somebody who thinks like that. Okay? So Zane, keep reading. It's just really important to make that distinction at the beginning, that when we talk about justification through faith versus justification through works, justification through faith, if you are a faithful person, you're going to try and do what it is that God wants, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, you recognize that you don't do what God wants all the time. And if you're going to count your works, which works do you have to count? Just the ones you want?
All of them.
All of them. And if any of those works fall short, was your work perfect?
No. Which is why the Pharisee is the one who is unjustified, because he wanted justification through his works.
Yeah, through what he does, right? And we're going to see that. All right, Zane, keep reading.
Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and one a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank thee that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector.
All right, stop right there. So he just said some things that are pretty undesirable, right? Like if you're introduced at a party and somebody says, oh, hey, George, this is my friend Steven. He's an extortioner. How is that going to go?
I would leave the party.
Right. All right. Hey, everybody, this is my friend Zane. He's really unjust. Right. Right. So he just said some things that are not desirable. And then he finishes that up by even like this tax collector, right? So it's the worst, right? He lists some things and then he's like, even this, right? It's the worst. And so the view of somebody like a Pharisee, the way that he would view the tax collector is that there's nothing worse that you can be.
They're the pirates.
Kind of. They are sellouts to the Romans. Right, because again, we're kind of getting inside the brain of somebody like this Pharisee. Their identity before God is the one who has the law. Right, they are the Jews who have the law, and it is the having of the law, being Jewish itself. Right, your identity as a Jew comes from the works in the law. This is their mindset. It's incorrect, but this is what they're thinking. Their identity comes from the works of the law. And that is what makes them Jewish, and that is what gives them standing before God. And this tax collector has committed one of the worst possible sins by becoming un-Jewish, right? By selling out to the Romans, by working for a foreign government. It's the worst. It's like un-Jewishness, right? And so that's what he's saying, because you could be a Jew who's an extortioner, and at least you're still Jewish. Right? Or you could be a Jew who is unjust, but at least you're Jewish.
It's got to be pretty bad if they'd rather hang out with extortioners than tax collectors.
Yeah, but a tax collector, it's treason, right? In their mind, it's treason. Okay, so now go ahead. So now, notice what he's done. He's kind of set up this barrier that I'm a Jew, not like that tax collector, right? Okay, go ahead.
I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get, but the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes up to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted.
Okay, so notice what he does. I thank you, God, that I'm not like him. Right? He doesn't say this, but kind of what it is I keep the law. And then notice how he identifies himself. What does he do?
His identity is in his actions. He gives his tithes. He makes his fasts. He avoids being a bad person.
Right. That is his identity. That's the idea of justification by works. Look at what I do. This is who I am. And because I am these things, now I'm in a right relationship with God. Right? And so Jesus is telling this parable to combat that idea. Right? And Zane, I'm really interested that you chose this to talk about this question. This is a really good approach to this. It's one that doesn't often get brought up as an answer to this question. Does God hear the prayers of sinners? But it's an entirely appropriate one. I'm glad you brought it up. And looking at kind of the context of what's going on gives us a really good foundation to move forward toward an answer. Well, there's a couple other places we're going to look, but I didn't think of this one. It was a really good job.
Really?
I don't think of everything.
Wow.
Not all the time. I mean, usually I do.
Once.
Right? So Jesus says,
Zane's like, point me.
here's this tax collector who does the right things. At least he thinks he does. And now, or the Pharisee who does the right things.
Okay.
Sorry about that. And now there's this tax collector who is so weighed down with his sins that he doesn't even have the courage to lift his eyes to heaven. He won't even look up. Right? He's just looking down the whole time. And he's beating his breast, which is a sign of...
Deep
Anguish.
remorse.
Yeah, remorse. What'd you say?
Anguish.
Anguish. Good words. Yeah. And he says, God, be merciful to who?
Me, a
Me.
sinner.
Me, a sinner. And now, according to Jesus, whose prayer did God hear?
The tax collector guy.
Yeah.
Sinner guy.
Well, he heard both.
Well,
so
he heard both.
yeah. So what?
Trick question.
Kind of, right? It all depends on what you mean by the word hear. Does God hear the prayer of a sinner? What do we mean by the word hear? So God hears both of these people talking. Right? He hears the guy who doesn't break the law, and he hears the guy who has broken the law. Right? In the story. And what you're dealing with is in a parable, it's a story. And so you have these characters who are set up. Here is one guy who keeps the rules, but who has a terrible attitude. Here is another guy who has broken the rules, but has a great attitude. Which of the two does God hear? He hears the guy who broke the law. If by hear, we mean God reacts to. And by react, we mean justify. So Jesus asked the question, which of these two is justified? God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you that this man went down to his house justified, the tax collector, rather than the other. So God heard the prayer of the sinner, right, in this parable. And Jesus told this story to shock people. Right? It's not really shocking to us because we've heard the story a lot and we know it. And we know the Pharisees are the bad guys in the New Testament. All right, but if you're Jewish in the first century, the Pharisees are the good guys.
It would be like if a group of preachers is like kind of comparable. I mean,
Yes. Yeah, you would tend to think that, if there's anybody who loves God, if there's anybody who wants to, who's, takes the time to study, that it would be like a group of ministers or preachers or somebody like that, right? You would think that you could trust that those people would be like that. Those are the Pharisees, right? To a Jew in the first century, the Pharisees are the heroes of the law. The Jewish people got in trouble over and over with God in the Old Testament for not following the law, and they get sent off into Babylon. And when they're called back, there's something that's begun called the Great Synagogue. And out of that movement, this focus, they realized, hey, we didn't do what God said, and we wound up almost getting destroyed because of it. And so we're going to focus on what God says, and we're only going to do what God says because we don't want to wind up like we were before. And so the Pharisees come out of that movement. Then the Jews don't do that. They wind up in trouble again with some Greek kingdoms. We're not going to get into all the history. And then there is another rebirth of Jewish thinking.
their Great Awakening,
kind of like a Great Awakening, a revival of going back to the text in the second century, and they're going to throw off the Greek kingdoms. They're going to come back, and they're never really going to be free. But there starts to be a huge division between the Jewish people on those who are going to be Hebrews and those who are going to be like all the others, just Greeks, right? And so a result of that is the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the New Testament. The Sadducees are very Greek in their thoughts. The Pharisees are very Jewish, very Hebrew. And so if you are a Jew, the defenders of the faith, right, the people who keep the Hebrew menorah burning, right, it is the Pharisees. So they're the heroes. So when Jesus tells this story and the Pharisee is the bad guy, that should cause you to go, wait a minute, this isn't right. Right? And so you could come up with some modern parallels, which we're not going to do, but you could come up with different characters, right? And you could retell the parable in a way that shocked modern hearers. But this was a shocking story to hear that the guy who keeps all the rules isn't the one that God hears. He's not the one who gets justified. It's the guy who didn't keep the rules. Not only did he not keep the rules, he's a sellout to the Jewish nation. And so this is a really good parable, a really good place to go for an answer, Zane. Good job. All right, so what else? How else would you answer this? What else are you thinking that we should consider?
In the question, does God hear a sinner's prayer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or does God hear a sinner when he prays, or they pray? And the reason why we're wording it like that is because there is something that people often call the sinner's prayer.
Oh.
And we just want to we want to make sure that we are as clear as we can be with our words. So does God hear a sinner when they pray? It seems like the answer is going to be
maybe yes.
Yes, it seems like that's where we're headed. Okay, go ahead. What were you going to say?
I was thinking about Jonah. He was a prophet, but when he prays to God, he's being punished for his repeated sins of trying to evade doing what God told him to do.
Yeah, and so again, what do you mean by sinner? Do you mean somebody who has never had a relationship with God, or do you mean somebody who has had a relationship with God, but now they've fallen away?
Well, it'd be hard to pray to God if you don't even know that he exists or recognize him.
Right. So the question presupposes, in a sense, that there is some kind of relationship there, or like you said, who do you even know to pray to? So if we're talking about somebody who has never heard of God, they don't even know who he is, but they know that there is a God, and so they are trying to find him, like Paul said, we have groped our way towards him in the darkness. If that's who we're talking about, that seems like a different scenario. So now, if we mean by sinner, somebody who, unlike Jonah does wrong, but then repents. This tax collector has repented, right? He's in the temple, he's praying to God. If we mean somebody who just thumbs their nose, or to go Shakespearean, bites their thumb at God, right? If that's who we're talking about, somebody who just doesn't care, they know there's a God, they know what they should be doing, they have been brought up. Let's just keep our Pharisee example. They've been brought up. They know all the commandments. They know who God is. They know what they ought to be doing as a Jew, but they just don't care. They know they're not supposed to eat pork, but man, bacon sure is good. So I'm just going to eat bacon anyway.
I can think of something that reminds me of that.
Okay.
In the Old Testament, I don't remember exactly if it's Samuel or Kings, but it talks about how King Saul is losing his kingdom because of his repeated sins, and it gets so bad where he's not listening to God that eventually he's praying to God and God doesn't even listen to him.
Yes. God doesn't speak to him anymore. Right?
And then he tries to call up Samuel, and Samuel's like, you're in this pretty bad.
Yeah. So there is a sense in which when you have severed your relationship with God, God doesn't answer your prayers anymore. So here is, we'll refine that word some, right? There isn't anything that happens that escapes God's notice. So yes, if people are thinking, praying, speaking, he knows that it has happened. But does he respond to it?
Well, there's kind of a difference between hearing something and then like paying attention to it. Like a difference between background music or like a performance. Like if someone's performing music for you, you're listening, you're paying attention, maybe you'll give them feedback. If it's just like elevator music, yeah, it's there, but you may not even notice it.
Yeah, you don't
care.
Give heed to it. You don't. Yeah, and so there is a sense, and I think that example with Saul is a good example. Here is somebody whom God chose. He chose him to be king. He had him anointed king, chosen to be king. He raised him up. There's a really good relationship there. And at the very beginning of Saul's reign as king, things are going well. He's humble. He considers other people. there are some hints, right? When you get into some textual evidences, there are some hints that a storm is looming on the horizon. But at the very beginning, things are okay, right? They seem to be okay. God has chosen this man, but he veers off to the point where he has offended God's prophets. He has violated the law. He has superseded his authority as king. He takes advantage of people. He just becomes the opposite of what God intended the king to be. And so at that point, God tears the kingdom away from him and no longer gives heed to his prayers. And so at that point, you would say, well, God doesn't hear him anymore. Right? He doesn't answer. And so there is a sense in which, yes, if that's what we mean by that question, yes, there are times where that is the case. However, who is the one that knows that that's what's happening?
Saul.
Saul and
Sam?
God.
Okay.
God. Yeah, Saul and God. Saul is the one who knows that God isn't hearing him. There's not like a tribunal or a council that decides God is not going to listen to you anymore, right? Like the Pharisees try to be in the New Testament. They try and decide who's in and who's out. And so that comes down to judgment. You have to be very careful that you're not passing judgment on people. But somebody who breaks their fellowship with God, if you don't have a relationship with God, why would he listen to you? Right? So what I mean is, if I'm downstairs and your mom comes home and she says, please make supper. She just asks me, will you please make supper? Am I making supper?
Yep.
Why?
Because you love her.
Yeah. If one of the neighbors across the street calls me and says, hey, make supper and bring it over to our family, am I making supper?
Depends.
Actually, I probably would.
Yeah, I was about
You're
to say.
just a really nice
You
guy.
probably would.
Okay, so let's do this.
If a pirate calls you,
President.
The president? I would make supper for the president.
Me too.
Or the president-elect. I would make supper for both of them.
I like mine better. If a pirate calls you.
It depends on who you're talking to, right? If I have a relationship with somebody and they ask me for something, I'm much more likely to give it to them. And that's kind of the idea. Now, what should we be doing, right? We're supposed to be loving our enemies. And God does that, right? God sends the rain on the just and the unjust. He sends the sun to shine on everybody. We are oblivious to many of the blessings that God rains down upon all humanity. We don't realize sometimes how good God is to all people, right? Sending the seasons, keeping things working, the universe working, right? Those are all blessings from the Lord. But there is a sense in which when you ask him for something special, like Saul asking God to do things, there is a sense where God says no, because you've broken our relationship. Right? There are special family relations, that exist in a family, that you can call upon somebody in your family to do something where you couldn't just call upon a stranger. If you walk down the street and you just ask random people to give you $100, I mean, yeah, there might be somebody who's really kind who gives you $100 if you're just asking for it. But if you were to come to me and say, hey, Dad, I need $100, I would arrange chores for you, and you could slowly earn that money over time to teach you lessons. Right? So there's a difference. If you needed something, I would try and help you. But a stranger who has no relationship with you, why would they? Right? So that there's that sense there where, yeah, in that way, you can see that in the Bible. All right, so now let's look at another place. Those are two really good examples. Let's look over in John chapter 9. This is normally
John the Gospel?
the Gospel of
Okay.
John, chapter 9. In my experience, this is normally when this question comes up, is when you're in John chapter 9. This is the story about the man who is born blind, which we talked about with our Bible reading.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a man who's born blind, and Jesus' disciples are walking by, and they see him, and they ask the question, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, so that he was born blind? And Jesus' response is, well, neither. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. So there are things that happen, not because somebody has sinned or done right, but because God is going to be working. So we must work the works of him, And this is going to continue down in this discussion. And it's this man who over in John chapter 9 is going to say, we know that God doesn't hear sinners. It's this man who says this.
Where?
I'm looking for it. I don't want to scroll around in the Bible as I read for it because I don't want to make people sick. So let's look at verse 30.
Oh, it's in verse 31.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay. So the Pharisees are asking, or the Sanhedrin, this council of the Jews, they're asking, who's this man? And the man answers, why is this an amazing thing? You know, I couldn't see and now I can, and you're trying to turn this into a question about the law. Why is this an amazing thing? You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. And this question where he comes from, they're like, is he serving God or not? That's kind of the question. Is he faithful to the Lord or not? Now here's what he says. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. All right, so let's take this as strictly as we possibly can. Who does God listen to?
The worshipers of God.
Okay.
People who want to have a relationship with him.
Okay. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, what are the two conditions that must be present, according to what this man says? What are the two conditions that must be present for God to hear you, to listen to you?
They worship God and do what he says, or
Yeah.
do his will.
Yeah. How much of that will?
I guess all of it.
Yeah, in fact, the law itself says that you're supposed to keep all the commandments. Okay? Now, this happens in the text of John directly before chapter 8. And there's a story at the beginning of chapter 8 about a woman who is brought before Jesus. And speaking to a crowd of people, Jesus says, "Let those among you who is without sin cast the first stone." How many people threw rocks that day?
Nobody.
0.
Even Jesus. Which is interesting.
Well, Jesus doesn't condemn her. Like speaking to the woman, Jesus is not condemning her.
Why doesn't he though? Because he is the only person there who would have been fit to condemn her.
Yes.
Because he was the only person who kept the entire law.
Yes. It's a lesson in mercy.
Okay. Sorry. I'm getting off topic.
Yeah. And so it's okay. And so Jesus says, let those of you without sin throw your rocks. And nobody does. So here, we know that if you're a worshiper of God and you do his will, then he hears you. So remember, as strictly as you possibly can understand this, in order for God to hear you, you have to worship him and
Do everything he says.
everything. Is there anybody then who God would hear?
No.
No.
Well, except Jesus.
No one.
Yeah,
Except for
Jesus, right? The Trinity could speak amongst themselves, but other than that, nobody gets heard, right? So if we're going to take that as strictly as we possibly can. Now, this man is probably speaking in an accommodative way, right? He isn't speaking as strictly as you possibly could take those words. And so when he says a worshiper of God and does his will, that's a pretty broad statement, and it would just mean people who are searching for God, people who are desiring God, and they do his will. God listens to them. And so this is an answer to the accusation that Jesus has a demon or is unrighteous or is wicked. And the man is just giving a very blanket answer to a very blanket accusation. He's just saying, look, I was blind and he just healed me. And that's a good thing. Now, would the power of God work through this man to accomplish this good thing if he were as wicked as you're saying he is? And the answer would be,
Well, no.
no. Right? And so what we have to do is we have to be careful that we don't take this statement and try and build a giant theological position off of it, because it isn't an attempt to create a theological position. It's an attempt to show the Pharisees, this group of men who are ruling over Israel, it's an attempt to show them that they're being ridiculous. Right? They're refusing to accept what their eyes can clearly see. And yes, that's on purpose, that pun, right? They're refusing to accept what is before them as obvious. And so he's like, look, God wouldn't be doing this through him if he were who you say he is. And that's the point. And so when you start looking at this, never since the world began, in verse 32, has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. Right? And Satan's not going to do it. When Jesus is casting out demons, they have the same accusation. Well, you cast demons out by the power of demons. What's Jesus' response to that?
It wouldn't be smart for Satan to hide himself.
Yes. A house divided, Jesus actually quotes Abraham Lincoln and says, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Prophetic foreknowledge.
See, even Jesus got in the good Lincoln quotes.
That's right. But it's amazing that here, that Jesus does the same thing. He's like, guys, you're being ridiculous. But Satan isn't doing this. And so that's kind of what this statement is in verse 31 of John. It's a, hey, wake up and listen to yourselves. And so that's kind of the idea. And it's sort of the same idea that we've talked about already, is that if you have no relationship with God, then you shouldn't expect, if you refuse to follow God, right? That's who he's talking about here, somebody who worships God and does his will, somebody who has a relationship with the Lord, they have fellowship with him, they desire to be with him, right? They're part of God's family, versus the person who just rejects God entirely. I want nothing to do with God at all. Right? So then, does God hear that person who wants nothing to do with God?
No.
I mean, God can do whatever he wants, but we have like Saul, that example where God doesn't answer him anymore. God doesn't speak to him anymore. And so it comes down to, when you're looking at Saul's example, Saul didn't want God to speak to him so that Saul could have a relationship with God. Saul wanted God to tell him what to do so he could win and be a successful king. It was very selfish. And so if you are seeking to really worship yourself, then are you a worshiper of God?
No.
If you refuse to follow God and listen to him, then are you really honoring God? No. If you blatantly refuse continually to do the things that God asks you to do, then are you somebody who does his will? No. You don't have the obedience that comes from faith, which is what Paul talks about in Romans. Right? Romans chapter 1, Romans chapter 16. He's made an apostle to bring about the obedience of faith among all the nations. And so what we're looking at here is when people don't care about God, then they should not expect to have God on their side. And Jesus will talk about some of the same things. You're either with me or against me. If you're not against me, then you're with me. He'll say things like that, just to kind of illustrate that what you're looking at here is a relationship. And so when we ask this question, does God hear the prayers of a sinner? Well, what do you mean by sinner? Like we've talked about, the man going to the temple, the tax collector, and also Saul. Those are two very different types of sinners. And then also, are you talking about somebody who knows nothing about God? Which in that instance, I think Romans 2 kind of talks about that, where that's a different situation, versus somebody who knows who they ought to be, and they just reject it. Right? And that is who Satan is. Right? He is one of the hosts of heaven. The Satan, the adversary, is one of the hosts of heaven, one of these spiritual beings created dwelling in the presence of God. And he rejected that. And so now, Jesus says over in Matthew 25, who is hell prepared for?
Satan and his angels.
Yeah, the Satan and his angels. Hell is prepared for them. Why? Because they rejected God. It's not a mistake. It's not somebody who didn't know. It's not somebody who's caught in a moment of weakness or somebody who has woken up. Maybe they had been in the dark and now they've woken up and they're coming back. It's Satan, with Satan in particular, where he knows what he is doing.
I have a question, or like a Bible story that might be related to this.
Okay.
What about King Jeroboam? when the kingdom splits between Rehoboam and Jeroboam after Solomon. And then Jeroboam doesn't want his people continually going to Jerusalem because he fears they might, go back to Rehoboam. So he builds his own place to worship God in where northern Israel.
Mm-hmm.
But even though that was against the law. And so he's conducting prayers and ceremonies there. Does God hear his prayers?
Yeah, no, that's applicable. He knows what he's doing.
He wants to make the people worship somewhere, even though he knows they're supposed to go elsewhere.
And he doesn't even care that they're worshiping God, and that becomes very clear throughout the rest of his story. There's all sorts of idols, he doesn't care. The only thing he cares about is he doesn't want them going down to Jerusalem or up to Jerusalem. They would say up to Jerusalem. He doesn't want them going to Jerusalem to worship God because he is afraid that it will keep a connection. And
Hamper his power?
Yes. So he just severs that entirely. He does not want reconciliation. He wants to rule his own kingdom. And that is actually a very fitting example because that is what Satan does in the garden. Satan wants to be God. He wants to be the ruler. And that is how he tempts the man and the woman. You too can be like God. You can be the ruler. And so then you see that there with Jeroboam. There is the rightful king, Rehoboam, but Jeroboam wants to be the ruler instead. And so he severs that relationship and establishes this new religion, which the Samaritan religion will be born out of that when you get to the New Testament. And so, yeah, that's a very fitting story. That is a physical picture, kind of what we do when we decide that we're just not going to listen to God. We're going to do our own thing. I don't care what God wants. It's like that. Very good job.
Well, thank you.
You guys are on point tonight. All right. So I feel like we've done a pretty good job of dealing with that question. There's a lot of nuance to it. It's not a simple, it's not a Boolean answer. It's not a yes, true, false, yes, no. It's a nuanced answer because there are different types of sins. There are different types of hearing. And so you kind of have to look at all those different things. And thankfully, on the last day, I don't have to decide that stuff. I don't have to decide who is like Saul versus who is like the man in John 9 or the tax collector in Luke 18. I don't have to decide that stuff. I don't have to decide who is really a David or who is a Jeroboam. I don't have to decide. God decides that. And so at the end of the day, God is going to listen to whomever God decides to listen to. We just have to be concerned about ourselves and be continually asking ourselves, who am I like? Am I like the Pharisee or the tax collector? And if you have the King James Version, it'll say publican. It's the same thing. Right? Am I like the Pharisee or the tax collector? Am I like Saul or David? Right? Who am I being? And that really is the major concern. Right? That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's kind of how I would address it. So it seems like your gut answer, your gut reaction, Zane, is correct. Yeah. And again, it's a nuanced yes. Yeah, he does, but there's some nuance to it.
What does nuance mean?
It means that there are variations, like there's movements within it. And so there are times where the answer will be yes, there are times where it's no. It's not a monolithic always yes, always no type thing. Like
it's anomalous.
Does a square have four corners? Right?
Yes.
The answer is always yes to that. By definition, a square has four corners. If there's something that only has three corners, it's not a square.
It's a triangle.
Right. So there's no nuance to that question. Right? There's nothing to consider. There's no variation in definition where you might have different things that you're thinking about.
Oh, that's why people will say like nuances of the law, especially when talking about like a legal code or the Old Testament or something like that.
Yeah. You can define the word sinner in a variety of different ways. And so you're looking at something that's variegated.
It's got levels and different.
Yeah. And it requires wisdom to answer because not every situation is exactly the same. And so instead of, just this monolithic, every answer is the same to every situation. You have to sit down and reason through it each time. And really, that's what the law of Moses is intended to do. It's intended to provide a framework for the Israelites to work through problems so that they would use God's wisdom and apply it to their life and learn to live like God. And Jesus does that in the Sermon on the Mount, which is a topic for a separate discussion. All right. Well, I thought we covered that pretty thoroughly, as well as you can in 45 minutes. But I'm glad that you guys were here with me tonight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for letting us join you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Love you both very much.
You too.
You too.
And if you're joining us, thank you for being here. God bless you. We love you. And we'll see you next